Hello, everyone, and welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 85 today, and I am talking to Ilana Rogol-Dixon, who is an embodiment catalyst and jewellery maker. So, thank you very much for joining us on the show, Ilana.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute honour.
No, I'm really pleased to have you on, and today we're going to be talking about this idea that it's obvious, and I've been told things were obvious, and I should have found them obvious for for pretty much my entire life, when they really have not been to me, and also found things really obvious that other people apparently didn't. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this one. I think it's going to be a very interesting show. If you happen to be new to Delightful Dissent, though, it's a shared exploration of something that people kind of tend to take for granted, overlook, or and a way to think differently about that. So I hope the show gives you some specific ideas that can help you in your personal and or professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it can give you some ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions yourself, because I think this is something that we should all do regularly and just should be just a normal part of life. And it's delightful dissent because we might be going kind of against the kind of standard way of thinking about stuff, but it's not about like winning an argument. It's not about changing other people's minds as much as it is about exploring all of the possibilities and having some fun whilst we do it. The show is genuinely live, so please do be aware that there might be strong language if that's an issue for you, and that we may talk about difficult topics. The most likely topics to come up in this show are really around neurodiversity, around being misunderstood, the negative judgments that can come from that, and trauma and its relationship to all of those things as well. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is all about asking questions and exploring. So if you're watching live, then please do ask questions in the chat and we'll try and bring them into the conversation. If you are watching the recording, then either wait for the end of the show where we'll talk about it, or check the show notes where there's information about how you can get in touch with both of us there. So, yeah, Ilana, we first met actually when you were one of the two brave people to come to a meetup I'd organised that happened to be the same day as a huge storm, which was great. So and we just had a really good conversation, and I think I particularly loved when we had our both that and the kind of planning chat for this. Your ability to connect this kind of slightly embodied, perhaps even esoteric stuff with something very grounded and practical as well, and to actually make something of it. So I really wanted to get you on the show. So yeah, thank you. But could you perhaps introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us maybe, yeah, who you are, who you work with, the kind of stuff you do.
Sure. I'm Ilana. It's Hebrew for tree. The kind of people I work with are mostly a collection of either people who have no idea what I do, and they turn up because they're curious, or because, and I quote, I just knew that I should. And also people who have some idea that they need what they would consider to be help. People who I just, through talking to them, I might mention something that they find really curious, and then they think, oh, I got to figure out this woman's head. And then they turn up at my door. A whole collection of people, a lot of people who perhaps wouldn't start by knowing that they are neurodivergent, and then after working together they suddenly think, oh yeah, hang on a second. I work with people who have had all backgrounds of trauma. Most of the time I would say the common denominator is the fact that they experienced a lot of being misunderstood, a lot of it. And that has affected them right into adulthood. I've worked with people who are in their 60s, people who are in their 20s, and it's kind of a common theme across the board, really.
Absolutely. And it's such a common neurodivergent experience. I wonder if it's almost universal to be misunderstood and misinterpreted in your being in the world, and the consequences of that can take a lifetime to unpick.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is universal. I would say that probably almost all of the neurotypical people that I know also experience being misunderstood. They just don't really care. But it's kind of like they don't care because they're not aware of the fact that it could have any kind of impact on them. Does that make sense? Like I watch it have an impact on them. my mother, for context, she's not biologically my mother. She is neurotypical, and her husband is autistic, much to my absolute delight, because it's giving her a whole new range of information. But I watch her interact with people, and I watch her experience being misunderstood. But it's almost like where we, perhaps as neurodivergent people, would internalize it, because we are so hungry for information and we are so desperate to know the why, that when we don't understand something, it's not as easy for us to just drop the fact that we don't understand it, or for us to drop the fact that we maybe haven't been understood. We're such curious beings by nature that that's like giving us a Japanese puzzle box and then somebody saying, oh, but you don't need to solve it. What do you mean I don't need to? You've just given it to me, you know? So I think it is a universal experience, not feeling understood. But I think it's the what happens in our brains afterwards that maybe separates us.
I wonder whether there's also a question of how safe it is to be understood. As I feel like my experience is like, if I'm misunderstood, it's going to be my fault. It's unsafe for me to be misunderstood. Whereas, and there are going to be consequences. Whereas I wonder for other people, perhaps for neurotypical people, it's like, okay, well, you misunderstood. It's not your, so that there's a different thing there going on somehow.
Yeah, I think to an extent. The typical example that I always use of this is when you were a child, whenever your parent would say to you, well, the dishwasher's full. And then that would be it. And for them, what they're actually saying is, the dishwasher is full, could you please empty it? But I think because it's neurodivergent people, for the most part, are so information-based, it's much more challenging for us to extrapolate information, or because we see so many possibilities in what you're saying, that unless you guide us down the right garden path, we're going to end up in the forest. So I think that does play into it. But I think for most people, neurotypical, neurodivergent, anywhere in between, I think that the feeling of being misunderstood does get internalized. I don't know that it gets internalized to the same level. And I imagine that it's probably because for neurodivergent people, it happens much more frequently. It's a much more strongly embedded experience in our lives. Most of my neurotypical friends did not struggle during school. The ones that I've known since school, they didn't struggle. They could read an entire exam question that was written in the space of 2 paragraphs and understand everything. And I'd look at it and I think, what on earth are these words? And then I'd ask a teacher, and the teacher would rephrase it into a sentence. And then I would ask, well, why don't they just write it as that sentence, to never be given an answer? Whereas the NTs over here, they've just assumed. I think that's a large part of it, is that I don't know, you talk about safety, I wonder if we don't feel as safe to assume. Because again, we see so many options in what a person might mean, if we assume, there is at least a 50% chance that we could go way off field. Whereas I think, neurotypical people don't tend to worry so much if they assume.
I feel like there's something, and I'm kind of like, I really want to, I'm just going to pursue this conversation thread rather than the format. Because like there's something, for me, there's something around what are we basing our assumptions on? And the fact that I have a different frame of reference. Ultimately, I have different foundational assumptions to most other people. I see the world differently. I experience the world slightly different. So it's always at an angle. My frame of reference is different. If I assume, like if I use my base set of assumptions to try and figure someone else's experience, unless they're an ADHDer, there's a very high chance that I'm going to be wrong. Because I know that most of the world experiences things differently to me. Whereas I think if you happen to be in that group where you experience the world pretty much like most other people, you can trust your assumptions to a higher degree in those interactions, because most of the time you're going to be right in terms of, like, they do experience the world like you do. So if you base your assumptions on that, you're probably going to be okay most of the time.
Yeah, I think part of it, if I'm totally honest, this is a bit more perhaps of an esoteric take, but I'm just going to say it. I think most neurotypical people just aren't as aware. They're just not. They're not as aware of the way that they think, the way that they process information. I know that a lot of neurodivergent people have a disconnection between their physical experience and what they're feeling and translating that into how they're then working in the world. But I would say that basing this on my general experience of living in the world and also the people that I work with, neurodivergent people are extremely aware of themselves. So I think that that's part of it. Yes, they make assumptions, but neurotypical people, in my experience, they're actually just not really aware that they're making assumptions. So therefore, they're not really aware that somebody else wouldn't find it obvious. A classic thing in that kind of context really is that, I mean, you mentioned, that you experience the world differently. There's that thing, isn't there, about how neurodivergent people can speak two languages. We can speak our own and we can speak neurotypical. And if you have been raised as a woman or raised around almost exclusively women, then you speak a third language. You speak the women's language, which is different. It took me years. I had almost exclusively female friends throughout high school, college, university. And if I'm honest, I hated it. I much preferred spending time with my male friends because they always meant what they said and they said what they meant. It was much easier for me to understand if they were taking the piss, to use a colloquialism, or if they were just being quite upfront. Whereas I have watched and grown up around almost exclusively women, and they tend to be experts at backhanded compliments. They tend to be experts at ribbing and taking the piss, but in such subtle ways that they might think they're being obvious, but they're not at all. They might, I mean, again, my mother's a perfect example. She does it frequently. And I asked her about it a few weeks ago, and she said, no, I know that I change my tone of voice and I change my facial expressions. And I actually just couldn't speak because that is not anybody else's experience of her. Everybody else's experience of her is that she doesn't change her tone of voice and her face, but she has grown up in a world of almost exclusively women and neurotypical people. So I think any conversation like this is so infinitely nuanced that I don't think that anything can be obvious. I don't think it's possible. Take two people who've grown up, take siblings. Siblings don't have the same parents, do they? Like biologically, yeah, they might have the same parents, but they don't because they came out into the world with different brains, meaning that their parents inevitably treated them differently. They could both be neurodivergent in the same kind of way. They could both be neurotypical in the same kind of way, but they would have experienced their lives and their upbringing very differently.
And yeah, there's some interesting research that's come out around twin studies, which are a big foundation of a lot of psychology, finding out that, this assumption that identical twins share a common environment turns out not to be true.
Yeah.
Is that the environment bifurcates over time, and so small changes add up, and so the environment separates itself. So there's some definitely really interesting and challenging stuff around what we can and can't assume. I'd like to, before we get into it, I mean, we've been doing this for a little while now, but have you got a quote that you'd like to share that kind of brings a bit of a perspective that you like to this assumption or this idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple quote. I think it's an excellent container for this entire topic, and it's just no expectations. It came from a friend of mine. I remember it extremely clearly. We talk about giving people help. I make it really clear to everyone that I work with that I'm not here to help you. I'm here to help you, right? I could wax lyrical about dreams, let's say, for an hour, and you could retain none of it and it could not be useful. But then a month later, somebody could say something across the road, you could hear it and remember that entire hour's length worth of conversation. And I remember giving this person news, that I didn't really think much of. Again, it's obvious. I thought was totally fine. And this person internalized it entirely and then just said, just no expectations. And it came at me like a wave. And it, I think, opened a phenomenal amount for me, brain-wise, neurologically. It changed everything about the way that I now process interactions. So yeah, that's it. No expectations.
I think it's really powerful. And you also, that story also touches on something that I find so often is almost like the other side of this it's obvious thing, is we tend to undervalue the stuff that's obvious to us.
Yeah.
Particularly if we're neurodivergent, we see, you know, our perspective is one of the most valuable things we offer. Professionally in particular, it's one of the, and perhaps growing up, you know, certainly my schooling didn't encourage a lot of alternative perspectives, let me put it that way, and quite a lot of workplaces actually struggle to integrate that as well. But really, when it comes down to it, those differences in perspective, just being able to express them, speak them out, and explain them to other people are some of the most valuable things we can offer.
Yeah.
And we often seem to learn that the stuff that's obvious to us is something maybe that we need to hide, or, you know, other stuff that, you know, isn't of value to anyone. When actually very often it really is. And some of the thing is just being able to say it out loud.
Yeah. I mean, to get to that point takes a phenomenal amount of inner strength. You know, authenticity is the highest electro vibration in which we can exist, but it's bloody hard to get there. I think it's interesting. I've just had a memory pop into my head. I think part of it as well is that, I don't know if this is something that you experience, but to an extent, I've always considered myself very difficult to insult. I was mercilessly bullied in school, like really, truly awful stuff. And I never noticed. It never actually bothered me because most of the insults were really obvious things. So it was things like, oh, you're a Jew. Yes. Oh, you have spots on your face. Yeah. Right. For neurotypical people, they're taught that facts, let's say, or somebody's opinion is therefore inherently an insult. And I think that in large part that can change the way that they word things and the way that their tone is affected. And that's then what we internalize, especially if, I mean, I'm sure that most people will experience this, when somebody says something and their facial expression does not match the thing that they're saying.
It makes me feel very uncomfortable, actually. I have deep, like, it's very, like, I have, there's definitely a triggered something there for
It's
me.
almost physically painful. I don't think I will ever understand how this myth is still perpetuated. I fully understand how it came about, but this myth that neurodivergent people can't read social cues is nonsense. We can. It's just that you've just given me 3 and none of them match.
They're not congruent. Yeah. And I think in some ways I read the deeper the deeper cues really so like very loud to the point at which they obscure the surface cue.
Yeah.
I think that's the difficulty for me. You know, it's like if someone is saying one thing and their body and the way they're saying it says another thing, I hear that, not what they're saying.
Yeah. And it's exceptionally common. If I think about the way that so for context, I had an extremely aggressive spiritual awakening in 2021, like really deeply aggressive. For almost 2 years, I thought I had psychosis. And if I now think about the me that I was externally before then and the me now, they're so different in terms of my self-awareness for how I present. So touching on this, things that I thought were really obvious, my tone and my delivery did not match the things that I was saying. So even neurotypical people would have had a very difficult time understanding. I've been told numerous times, well, Ilana, that's really rude. And I'm thinking, but I've not actually said anything rude. That's something that I think a lot of neurodivergent people experience. A classic example is in college, I was studying musical theatre, and we were split into two groups. One group performed a chorus line, and the other one did Rent. And I was directly asked in the entire group, so both casts, my opinion on the musicals. And I was honest. I said, I don't really like either of them. I find them both kind of boring. And I kid you not, there was an actual in the room. And the head of staff, the one who asked me a question, looked mortified and so offended, as if I'd offended her parents or her being. And I asked her about it afterwards, and she said, well, you insulted me. And I said, did you write the musicals? She said, no, but I chose them. And it's only recently that I've sort of realised she has attached her sense of self and sense of being to a totally external thing. And I think that is something that we overlook a lot. Neurotypical people, especially, tend to really attach themselves to their decisions, to their thought processes, to the way that they work. And that then affects the way that they speak and the way that they live. And I think it's why I'm sure a lot of neurodivergent people experience this. It's almost like we're constantly offending people and insulting people, when really, if the same thing was said to us, I don't think we'd have the same response. We're so information-based that if I'd chosen these musicals and somebody had said, no, I really didn't like them, I would have just heard that. And then I would have thought, okay, cool. You're not saying you didn't like me. And that's a really key part of the it's obvious, is that sometimes I think almost we do need to make assumptions before we speak. We might need to make the assumption that actually the way that this person could perceive what we're saying is as an insult. But then we have to, then it's a whole thing. Then we have to really think about the way that we're presenting. And then we get into the subject of masking again. And it's, where do you go? It's like a landmine.
It is really, really difficult. And I see this in all sorts of ways, because, like people from different cultural backgrounds who have like lower power distance cultures, is they struggle in Britain, because we are so, it's like you have to. I know a lot of people from say Denmark or the Netherlands who are both much flatter power cultures, and they find it really, really difficult that you have to start every email with, how are you doing, how's it going? It's like, and it's like, but I also know a lot of autistic people who have exactly the same problem. And I worked as a computer engineer for a long time, and one of the weird things about the culture of engineering is computers don't care about your feelings. And so when you are actually directly working with these things, you learn to be very blunt, because it's like, this will not work. It's like, it doesn't care. The computer doesn't care. It one way or the other. It's completely indifferent.
Yeah.
And so we get used to working with these very non-human objects. And we pick up some of the, in the way that we work effectively with them. We need to be direct, because we need to say, no, there's no way this will work. It doesn't follow. It's like, it doesn't care. And one of the things I've really struggled with, often actually ended up in a role doing, but also found, perhaps maybe because I did find it came to conscious awareness, was this mediating between this very fixed computer world and the people that worked primarily in that, and the kind of organizational businessy world, which is very much like you say, it's appearance and political and like very, is all niceties, and that the gulf between those two is huge sometimes. And it's just, it's a real challenge.
I find it really challenging because it's inefficient. It's probably
you make a great engineer,
but it's just inefficient. I used to have a German friend who started working in the corporate world, and I, in my early to mid 20s, worked at American Express in the regular card and then the travel section. So I had to deal with this kind of nicety stuff all the time, and he would he would send me an email that he had received at work, and he would ask me, is this person being passive aggressive? Because I'm German and I can't tell if this person is being genuine or passive aggressive. And I think growing up largely around women, have got very good at knowing if someone's being passive aggressive, even if it's written. But I completely agree. Why are you asking me how I am if you don't actually care? I think that's the thing. I've had this said to me quite a few times recently. Actually, it's interesting. I'm just going to very quickly, the link between sort of trauma and neurodivergence, just very quickly. Quite a few of my neurotypical friends, if this ever comes up, they will directly say to me, "Oh, I don't think you've got ADHD at all. I think you've just got trauma." And what I respond with is, it's funny, the more trauma I heal, the more ADHD I feel. Trauma did the opposite to me. Trauma made me think that I was just like everybody else. And it was leaving all of that stuff and shedding it that now I'm like, oh, no. There's deep neurodivergence. But I find myself being even more task orientated. If I'm walking around with my partner in town and we're having a really jolly conversation, it's all laughter and games and everything, but then I've got to go into a jewelry shop and I've got to look at 1,000 different things on the wall. A neurotypical person can very seamlessly just flow in. They can continue the conversation and they can involve the cashier with it. Not a chance for me. You're asking my brain to switch from, I was about to use a technical term, but I don't think I know any computer terms well enough to. You're asking me to switch from a VHS to a Blu-ray without changing the machinery involved. So I think that comes back to it's obvious. A lot of people would see that as being really rude. But for me, it's not that I'm being rude. Being rude is the assumption that I'm offending you. It's all about you. And it omits the fact that actually my seeming rude is because I am having an internal hard drive shift. I'm shifting from being outside, having one conversation, to suddenly being in a room with totally different lighting, totally different sounds. I can hear 10 different conversations and I can pay attention to all of them. And I'm here specifically to do a task. If the cashier person then asks me how I am, everything in my being goes, you've just given me another thing, and I have to extrapolate whether or not you're actually meaning the question that you're asking me. I'd love to live in Denmark or the Netherlands, where that stuff just isn't necessary. I can just walk into the shop, I can just say to the cashier, "I have this, please," and then I can buy it and I can leave. Yeah. You
don't even have to use the word please.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's not really a word in Danish. So yeah, I'd like this. That's as polite as it gets. But yeah, there's something really interesting for me. There's two, this idea of what's obvious is really related to, there's something around capability and what is so easy for us that we don't even notice we're doing it. And one of those things is, one big part of that is context. And for me, so much of this is related to, what's obvious is, it's obvious because it derives from context.
Yeah.
And if you construct context differently, then it's going to be much more of a struggle. And this is, one of the famous a lower support need autistic person is needing a lot of verbal context. And I ask for a lot of verbal context. I think that's part of the reason, actually, why quite a lot of us end up in coaching, healing, therapeutic roles, because we get so good at eliciting verbal context. Actually, people are like, "Oh, I've thought of something I haven't." You by laying it all out for people, it actually helps them understand it in a different way. But we get so good at doing it just because we needed to be able to understand, like, why are you upset? Why is this difficult? Why, in our day-to-day lives. But there's need for verbal context, and the difficulty when context moves, when context shifts, without expecting it, without planning it, without the cues, without when for me is like, if I'm trying to do something in this context, is like, don't make me go to that context and then come back to this context, because I have a limited number of swaps per day, basically.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, I can do it, but every time I do it, it's harder, and going back to something is more effort. And then it's like, so there's, yeah, for me, a lot of this is context.
Yeah, I agree. It's the top down versus bottom up. Off screen, you and I were discussing this anyway, but if I don't, this was such a battle for me in school all the time. I cannot even begin to tell you how many times I ended up in detention, staying late after school, because I would ask my teacher, why am I learning this? They hated it. Why am I learning this? And I was routinely labelled as irritating, a know-it-all, or I question too much. I've been told many times in my life, you ask too many questions. My response always is, maybe you don't ask enough questions. I think a large part of it is because, at least in my experience, and I can only speak of my experience, neurodivergent people are much better at ignoring ourselves. So when we're hunting for context, and I don't know if this is due to masking or just the nature of the way that our brains process information, but we are much better at, it's almost like if you imagine you walk into a library, a neurotypical person would probably say, well, which book is for me? Which book is mine? Which book am I? Whereas a neurodivergent person would say, which book do I need to understand the topic that we're discussing? And then they would take a step back so they could see even more books. I think we have such a much wider range of perspective. I saw this in my ex-husband all the time. Autistic, experiences many traits of ADHD. I don't know whether or not he is, so I'm not going to say that he is. But he and I could talk about everything all the time. It was partly why we fell in love with each other, because I met someone who could talk as much as I could, and he experienced the same. And we used to talk about this quite often, is that if I brought you into a completely white room and there's a white table, and on the table is a glass, and the glass is half full of water, and I asked you, what do you see? Most people would say, I see a glass of water. But in my experience, most neurodivergent people would either tell you everything that they see, or they would ask you, can you be more specific with your question? Because they can see everything and they don't know what answer you want from them. That comes back to the expectations, right? If I put down a fork, a spoon, and a knife, and I asked you, you get one answer is correct, A, B, or C. Which do you use to stir a cup of tea? That question makes everything in my being hurt, because as we know, the answer is, well, any number of them. But really the answer is, which answer do you want from me? And unless I know that context, I don't know how to continue. And I think that's where a lot of the shutdown comes from. A lot of the freeze response or the flight response is because we don't know what you expect, we have to find out the context first. And I think actually a lot of the time, at least for me, when we're asking context, that is what we're asking. We're actually asking what you want from this interaction.
Yeah.
Because we're so able to remove ourselves. I'm not going to assume that you stating an obvious fact about me, oh, I have a crooked nose, is an insult. But if I ask you, what do you mean by that? And it turns out that you were trying to insult me, great, cool, I will pretend that I'm offended. And then we can continue with our day.
Yeah. I love the idea having to perform being offended. And it really is a thing, because people get quite upset. If you're not like, if you don't respond, they're like, they get even more upset, and then they become a genuine threat. It's like so there is all sorts of like yeah, that idea. And I so resonate with the idea of asking too many questions and getting in trouble for asking questions at school. It's seen as being disruptive, or seen as being like, and I had the same problem at work, working for, and like why are you asking this? Why? It's like, because I need this context to be able to operate in this space.
Yeah.
And like this idea of, and there is something, and I think there is also that, there's one of those things that is, because we are asked to step outside of our own experiencing, our own perspectives so often, if we don't fit, and this is true for people from a different culture as well, but if the neurodivergent, anyone who thinks differently about the world, structures, we are asked to step outside of that experience so regularly that it's very easy to forget that some people aren't.
Yeah.
And I think, and actually some people find it not downright offensive. They find it challenging. They find it awkward to be asked to even operate in this space.
Yeah.
And I think when we're asking people questions like, why are you thinking that way fundamentally? When we're asked this all the time, so we kind of learn, we're we're questioned. So we don't think of it as a difficult question particularly, or a rude question, or an exceptional question, because it's always
yeah.
When for people who think in that kind of culturally conventional way, it's a shock.
Yeah.
It's like to step outside of that, and it's a challenge.
I think you've summed it up perfectly. Perceived threat is the greatest threat to our existence. Just as an overarching humanity, perceived threat is the greatest threat, right? The opposite of belonging is fitting in, which is kind of weird, because the thing that we all want is to feel like we belong. But merely the act of trying to fit in means that we do not belong, right? The asking questions. I don't care about children until they get to the why stage. And then I am the person to leave with your child.
I love the why game.
It's my favorite game.
I have one of my most treasured experiences is winning the why game with a toddler, and then being like, all right then, and then just wandering off. It's like you never like the idea of it is like, why? It's like,
yeah. To have more stamina of curiosity than a toddler is a very impressive feat. Yeah. I think neurotypical people don't really ask why. If I'm being really honest, I think a large part of it is because they're exhausted. Find me a person in this world who has not experienced trauma. You cannot, right? And I find that, and I can say this pretty much across the board, pretty much every neurotypical person I know lives in functional freeze. And functional freeze, one of the first things that it removes is curiosity. Because you're just exhausted. You don't actually have the power, the brain power, the body power, the spirit power to be curious. When I was living in Canada, 2018 to 21, I went through my strongest patch of being depressed. I mean, I'm talking, sleeping for 13 to 18 hours per day without issue. And the time I was awake wouldn't move. And I've discussed it with clients before. I have total transparency. And normally the question is, well, what was happening in you? And the answer is nothing. There was nothing happening. There was no space for curiosity. My grandmother is in a home right now. And I went to visit her a couple of weeks ago with my mum. And on the way there, the more neurodivergent I realise I am, the less she and I have to talk about. And it now kind of is, she tells me stories about other people, which I've also experienced as a very neurotypical thing. They like to talk about other people. Anyway, she was telling me this lovely story about a new resident who had, I think he's 70 something. He'd pulled his trousers down in front of her sister and they laughed. It was hilarious. And I asked, oh, why do you think he did that? And she said, oh, I don't know. I didn't think to ask. And at that point, I actually couldn't continue the conversation because I realized, oh, you just told me this thing, but what do I do with it? And that, I think, is a really common thing for neurodivergent people. What can I do with this information you've given me? Why have you given it to me? It's not obvious until I know why you've given me this information. I think we like to contain things. We like to have a container for things. It was a lovely story, and the gentleman in question is a beautiful person. And I found the story kind of funny, but actually, if I'd known why, I think I would have found it funnier. If I knew context, then that really quick sentence could have become a novel. And I think we all experience, to bring it back to it, we all experience trauma in very different ways. But for me, coming into no expectations and viewing every human being as the way that their trauma may have changed them has really helped me to be able to handle the "it's obvious" bit, or to be able to extrapolate context. You know, when I have conversations with people and they say something that might be really mean, I no longer immediately think that they're being really mean. I actually hear, "Oh, who said that to you when you were a child?" And it removes any layer of, I don't have any context. It actually, yes, it's an assumption. I'm giving myself context on their behalf. But I have found it a much easier way to navigate interactions with people. And I find that with neurodivergent people, I can actually just ask them that question quite often. Even if they do find it intrusive, or even if they do find it rude for me to ask that question, I can see that that question has now turned in their head. So the curiosity has been piqued. So now they're thinking about it. So now a conversation and a discussion can be formed. Curiosity is the greatest unifier, I think, of all neurodivergent people. And I think it's why we struggle so much with knowing the context and feeling like, this thing is obvious to you, why isn't it obvious to me? But actually, if we asked the question, is this thing obvious to you? And if it is, how? I think that would solve so many things, because we're also working on the assumption. We're working on the assumption that it's obvious to you, but actually it might not be at all. You might have no idea what you're talking about. You're just regurgitating something. Or you haven't questioned, so you're asking us question B out of A to Z, right? Does that make sense? I think the fact that we question so many things can be a real asset, and it's such a shame that so many neurodivergent people have become kind of terrified of asking questions and terrified of asking for clarity because of the perceived threat, especially in childhood. If we are scared of our primary caregiver, we will do whatever we can to fit in with our primary caregiver. And a lot of the time that means not asking questions. I think once we get to adulthood, or an environment where we are no longer reliant for survival on those primary caregivers or reliant on our friends, then we have to start recognizing within ourselves that it is now safe to ask questions. I no longer have the care. I have the patience and I have the time. I don't have the care to spend my time around people who are not curious. That's my only qualifier for a human being. I don't care. I actually don't care if you're anti-Semitic. I don't care if you're kind of racist. I don't care if you're homophobic. As long as you're not negatively impacting other people with your behavior and your thoughts. But if you're curious, come on in, because now we can find context together, or we can find what the obvious thing is together.
Mm. I think the one thing for me around the fear of that, what comes up for me is, I think it's dealing with authority very often. The one place I still have the fear, which I had interacting as a child, and I think in some cases remains a legitimate fear, unfortunately, is interacting with authority. Yeah. Because it's drawing a specific context, it's making specific assumptions, and being able to fit in with those is not always something that I either can do or know what is intended, or, and this shows up all the time and time again in terms of how I interact with various different figures, and like it can cause me problems from doing my tax return all the way through to like all interactions with authority just have that, like, you're not allowed to ask the questions, or it's very hard to get the kind of questions I ask answered.
Yeah.
It's like, I do wonder about FAQs sometimes. It's like, it's like, I guess, but like, could we have, could we have more infrequently answered questions as well?
What's that one random question that person asked you at 3 a.m? Yeah. Because chances are there's going to be somebody else in the world who is also curious about that. I'm going to put that on my website. Thank you. Infrequently asked questions. I like that.
That is actually what the thing on my website is. That's kind of like. And the other side of it is, like, frequently asked questions you should just answer implicitly. It's like, you shouldn't have a separate thing for frequently asked questions. You should design that out. Like,
I have a thought on this. I agree, but I think for the most part, the frequently asked questions, you'll find that they are already answered somewhere on the website. It's just that most people, including myself, we just want ease. We just want to know the answer to the question without having to go all around the website and read all of the information. If the answers to your frequently asked questions are only on that page, then you have failed from the offset. But if it's a duplication, then I think I agree, that should be the standard. It should be somewhere else. The authority thing I find really interesting. Oh God, yeah. What even is authority? This is such a neurodivergent thing. I don't believe in authority. Why should I? Why should I respect you just because you're older than I am, or because you chose to work as a police officer? You chose a job. But you as an individual human being, you might be awful. You might be morally bankrupt. So why should I respect you? The fear thing is really deeply ingrained, I think. From a trauma perspective, I would say that it's because the child version of you hasn't had that healed physically in your body. So that nervous system flight and probable freeze, that's where the masking comes in, is largely freeze and flight. That nervous system side of you is still going and vibrating. But also it's totally understandable, because if you get the answer wrong on your taxes, that has real ramifications. That's the thing, is like, yes, some of it is trauma and like past resonance, and some of it is real. That's the very difficult thing about interacting with this stuff as an adult who's unpicking it when you're, and for other people, perhaps for neurotypical people, there's less of that. That's true. Yes, the risks are there, but the kind of, they just don't hit that. The guardrails are there for them. Also, they just assume that they know the answer.
That's because the guardrails, they're guided by they make the kind of mistakes that are accounted for by the design of the system. Whereas we make different mistakes.
That's a good way of looking at it. I think, we see more options. If you see more room for error, there is arguably going to be more error. If we see more ways in which we could go wrong, there is a greater likelihood that we will go wrong. I think it's why so many neurodivergent people are risk adverse, but then also you have the other side of not risk adverse at all. You have in the brain world, you have two types of questioners. An old friend of mine mentioned this to me, because he is very much one type and I'm the other type. The first one is the person who won't ask you to do them a favor because the answer might be no. But the second type is a person who will ask you a favor knowing fully well that the answer might be no. I fall into that camp. It's the don't ask, don't get. But the problem is that the person being asked, two types of responders, it's obvious. They might hear you ask the question. Let's say, Matthew, can I stay on your sofa for a week, please? Right? I know fully well that the answer might be no, but I'm asking because the answer might be yes. But you may hear me ask that and immediately think, well, shit, I have to say yes because Ilana is expecting that she can stay on my sofa for a week. I have to say yes now. So I have to put myself out of the way and do this favor for her, even though it's going to cause me all of these issues. And bang, trauma. Even as an adult, that sets off your nervous system and it's doing all sorts of things. Or you have the second person who says, no, you may not sleep on my sofa for a week. Both of those things might seem really obvious, but you've got 4 different outcomes, essentially, from asking or not asking a question.
And it also, like, it makes me think that there's something around, you know, our own relationship to this. Is if we're very reticent to ask for something, we're going to assume that maybe people only ask when it's a real emergency and there are really big consequences and it's like really desperate and it's the only option, and that they wouldn't ask otherwise.
Yeah.
And so we assume that the cost of saying no to them and potentially to the relationship is much greater as well.
Yeah. And I think also we don't want to seem rude by asking a question such as, why do you need or want to sleep on my sofa? For me, I don't know where this comes from, but despite all of the trauma I've experienced, I have never struggled to ask for help, ever. I think purely because if I don't ask for help, then I'm not going to be able to do the thing. And me being able to do the thing is vastly more important to me than somebody being weirded out or offended that I'm asking the question. Obviously, I'm not going to ask for help for people who have shown me very clearly that they are dangerous to ask, right? But my response to, can I sleep on your sofa for a week, would be, why? And this, again, goes down a rabbit hole. I'm not asking why because I'm being nosy or you know, I'm being insulting, but the person hearing that might think, oh God, now I have to explain everything. But actually I've asked why, because if it turns out that you have a really deep need, you're escaping domestic violence or something, I now know I have a lot of context and can now give you a place on my sofa and maybe help you with other things. I think partly we're so afraid of offending people that it stops us from asking questions that ultimately could help people. And we're doing it to ourselves. We're so afraid of offending somebody by asking a question for help that we hinder ourselves. We end up not getting the help that we need because we're afraid that the other person might perceive our question badly and that we might be punished for it. It's self-harm in a non-physical sense, although it has physical ramifications.
And almost in a collective way, you know, one of the interesting things around all of the work that I do in organizations actually is about this mutuality of need, and that we have, you know, you have one need and like you have a need and you have a thing that you're good at doing and helping other people with, and they have a different need and a different, you know, and so this idea of a mutual interdependence that's the only way we do it, is by really being open about this stuff and asking and inviting. And I think, you know, there's a big thing about with the it's obvious is like, if we have a need, is seeing our needs as burdensome, partly because that's modeled for us. We're taught that our needs are burdensome. If we depending on your kind of experiences growing up, but if you're neurodivergent, there's a very high chance that you were taught that for a significant part of your life. And this idea of a need for understanding of context itself, we can see as burdensome, as unwelcome, of like, whereas actually, you know, one of the really interesting things working with a lot of people, and in my own experience, is it's not burdensome deployed well. It's actually really, really valuable. As my talking this through has saved, you know, even back before I knew a lot of this stuff and knew this was really a strength, has saved organizations hundreds of thousands of pounds of doing stupid things because we just talked it through. And I was like, is that really, like, is that true? Can we say that? Is that what we say? And it's like, oh no, we're not. Oh, you know, and like, and now I kind of more consciously aware of this and actually deliver it for, you know, like work with people around this. But But really, that idea of being able to question and reflect back and ask the right questions, because questions are, one of the other side of the it's obvious thing is questions are obvious. Asking good questions is a skill.
Yes.
A real skill.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is something that we often overlook when we've asked. But if we practice asking questions a lot because we've had to, we can get very good at it and then use it in ways that help ourselves and others.
Yeah, I'm still learning how to ask questions. I used to have a friend who is 8 years younger than I am, really close friends, like sisters. And it used to baffle her the way that I would Google things. Like I would literally ask how to make a pattern for sewing a skirt. And she would just Google sewing skirt pattern. And it became a conversation quite often. And this was before me knowing anything about my neurodivergence, knowing even that I am neurodivergent. It was before all of this. Knowing how to ask questions is so important. And the bitch of it is that there's no way to learn how to without learning how to. It's so individual that I think for me, and I'm sorry if this offends anyone listening or watching, anyone who claims that they can teach you how to ask questions the right way is a snake oil salesman, because they're not living the existence that you're living. They might be able to help you with the FAQs, but they're not going to be able to help with any of the infrequent questions. The thing I feel it important to mention this, the thing that has really transformed the way that I interact with people is that I remove, as fast as I can, their room for assumption. So if I ask a question, I very clearly will say why I'm asking the question. And I do it not in a kind of, I'm just asking. No, it's none of that, because that then clouds the whole interaction and presents them with a plate of be really gentle with Ilana and sugarcoat everything, blah, blah, blah. And for my efficiency, I'm not interested in sugarcoating things. For me, it's more, why X, Y, Z? The reason I'm asking is so that I can have context to better understand how we can move forward. And I always frame it as a teamwork thing. It's never and this is general life, not just working with clients. I shouldn't say never. I very rarely phrase it as I'm asking for me. And instead I phrase it as I'm asking for you, because people want what helps them, or I'm asking for us. The us for me is so important because it removes perceived threat. If you now think and believe that we are on the same team, both of us are going to benefit exponentially, even from an interaction that is lasting for 20 seconds. But it takes a lot of healing to be able to trust yourself enough to be assertive and to be able to be upfront about how you're moving and why you're moving in the world in the way that you are. I'm not arrogant to suggest that everyone should just behave that way. It's a steep learning curve, a very difficult learning curve.
But it is a very useful thing, I think, to think about framing and asking questions with that. Why are you asking? It's an incredibly useful discipline for everyone to learn. And I think if more people would practice that, it would get better. We get better at it. We'd start looking at this, and I think that idea of being able to ask questions and contextualize the question that you've asked, that's a skill that you can practice and develop.
I think it also helps. It also helps to catch people out. How do I mean this? How do I say what I mean? I will ask someone, why are you asking me that question? And a lot of the time, it becomes very apparent to them that they had no idea why they were asking me that question. They had no idea why they were saying what they were saying. But if I watch their behavior and their body language and they fall into the camp of, I actually had no idea, then I will say, I'm asking why because, right? So it's interactionally based for me. I want to know why you're asking me the question that you're asking so that I know which answer is going to most benefit you. If you're asking me how much a bag of apples costs and I direct you to the bananas, what use is that to either of us? I've lost on a sale and you've left feeling misunderstood and confused. I think there's so much power in questioning why. I wish we weren't so afraid of it. But I think part of it as well is that we're afraid to ask ourselves why. Which is deep.
Yeah, and I think that wider exploration is that fear and being able to just say, is this that, give people a handle of like, is that what I'm experiencing when I'm experiencing this is a really, really powerful, valuable thing. So we're coming to the end of the hour, or we're at the end of the hour. Could definitely continue this one, which is always a sign of a really good show. But I think it's a really interesting exploration of all of this, and for me, I think really quite personal one. The obviousness of things, and hopefully it's given people a bit of an idea about how to work with it, and maybe also some, for me, like sometimes finding these explanations helps a lot with the self-compassion.
Yeah.
Helps a lot with, okay, that's why I was misunderstood. Not my fault. It's not my own problem. It's not like, being misunderstood is not just on you, and neither is it just on the other person.
Yeah. It takes two to tango. Yeah. The tool that I would provide anyone watching for this is kind of ironically, you need to work on the assumption that there are no assumptions. There is no such thing as obvious. It doesn't exist. Especially when we recognize that, unfortunately, due to the nature of being humans with human brains, belief carries more weight than fact. It just does. I could literally show you that you are incorrect in your belief. But if you so strongly believe that you're right, you are not going to physically see the thing that I'm showing you. It will look different. So therefore, what I think is obvious is just not going to be obvious, because you and I aren't even living in the same reality. So in terms of is it obvious? No, nothing is obvious. I think we so strongly, all of us as individuals, want to hold on to the belief that it is obvious to us. Therefore, that means that we're wrong if we don't understand the thing that's obvious to you. But there's at least a 20% chance that actually that thing isn't obvious to either of us. We're both just working on our own assumptions. So, if anyone is watching this and is curious, well, how do I live in that way? Remove the word obvious from your language when talking to yourself, when talking to other people. If you're struggling to learn something, if you ever catch yourself saying, why am I learning this? It should be so easy. No, why should it be? Einstein was dyslexic. Nothing is obvious. I think that kind of makes everything a bit more exciting, if I'm honest. If everything were obvious, I'd be bored.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And the fact that it isn't obvious is something that's fun, and celebrate, the curiosity, and the fact that I think is a really lovely way to wrap it up. Yeah, absolutely. It's not bad news at all. It's great. It means we can find more stuff out and have fun.
Yeah, it's like being given the ultimate detective game constantly. Yeah. What more could a neurodivergent brain want than to be given an endless array of puzzles?
Puzzles, yeah, exactly. The world is this kind of puzzle shop. No, I love that. That's amazing. So if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that? We've got your website and your Instagram on the in the show notes. So but you also mentioned that you're in the midst of changing some stuff around. So is there anything you want to tell people about there?
Yeah, I'm slowly moving away from my current profession. I will still be, I don't like to use the word healing. It I don't want to profess to be a healer of any kind. I think we're all healers. But in terms of doing that for money, I'm moving away from it. If anyone is interested in working with me, I use a range of therapeutic methods. Some are very heavily embodied, some are somatic, some are body-based, all in the least threatening way possible. I understand, I've lived with dissociation myself, and learning to experience yourself is just terrifying. Some of it is talk therapy, some of it's just drawing. But my website may or may not cease to exist by the end of this year. I think I will still have a blog and a contact page, but I'm trying to taper out that way of existing, and I'm moving more into jewelry. By no means, in case I've tricked this in anybody's brains, by no means does this mean that I'm not willing to work with anyone if they are interested. It's just I'm no longer going to be advertising myself. If people want to advertise me, great, it saves me a job.
Wow.
Yeah, but Instagram or the website are probably the two best ways. If anyone's confused about the Instagram, it's my middle name and first name, middle, but switched. So it's middle name, first name.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyable. Really.
Thank you for having me. What a great Monday afternoon this has been.
I know, it's great. It's lovely, really interesting conversation. So I really did. I hope you and the audience found that useful as well. And if it did, do reach out and ask and share it with anyone who you think might find it useful too, because that's how most people find their way to this stuff. And you'll find past episodes and upcoming episodes available both on YouTube and LinkedIn if you want to have a look at other ones. The next episode I'm going to be talking to Kanan Tekchandani, who is a holistic coach for gifted and twice exceptional adults. Ooh. So we're going to be talking about the assumption nothing's wrong. And this idea that, I've definitely spent a lot of my time felt like things weren't right, but they still didn't get counted as wrong enough to be an issue or to warrant any time or energy to address them. So I think it's going to be a really, really interesting one to explore. That's going to be at 1 p.m. UK time on Friday, the 9th of February. And I very much hope to see you then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.